Ethan walked into my kitchen with his hand resting lightly on the small of a young woman's back, both of them smiling in the particular bright, hopeful way new couples smile when they've decided this dinner actually matters, and he said, "Mom, I want you to meet Chloe." I'd spent the better part of that afternoon making his favorite pot roast, the same recipe I'd made for every important dinner since he was in high school, humming along to the radio, genuinely looking forward to finally meeting the woman he'd been talking about with such quiet excitement over the past month. I felt my stomach drop straight through the floor before I'd even finished registering her face, because I already knew exactly who she was. I had spent 4 months, 8 months earlier, building a file on this woman under a different name entirely, a file that had gone cold not because the evidence was weak, but because the victim, a 74-year-old widower named Harold Given, had been too ashamed to keep cooperating once the humiliation of what had happened to him finally set in. I looked at my son's girlfriend, smiling at me now with her hand extended for a handshake, introducing herself as Chloe Bennett, and I smiled back, and I shook her hand, and I did not let a single flicker of what I was feeling reach my face. "It's so nice to finally meet you," I said, and my voice came out steady in a way that surprised even me, because inside my chest something had gone completely, permanently still. I remember the exact texture of her palm against mine, warm and ordinary, and thinking, with a strange, distant clarity, that I had shaken this same hand before, metaphorically, across a case file I'd studied for months, and never once imagined I would do it literally, in my own kitchen, with my own son standing beside her. My name is Diane Kowalski. I'm 52 years old, and for the last 14 years I've worked as an investigator with my state's Adult Protective Services Elder Fraud Unit, the kind of job most people don't know exists until it becomes the only thing standing between an elderly parent and the person who's slowly, patiently draining their life savings. I spend my days interviewing frightened, embarrassed victims who've been manipulated by people trained deliberately to identify exactly which vulnerabilities to exploit: loneliness, early cognitive decline, grief after losing a spouse, a trusting nature built over decades in a world that used to be safer than the one they're navigating now. I build cases the way you build any careful, patient thing, one verified detail at a time, cross-referencing bank records against phone logs against the small, specific lies a con artist tells that eventually, if you're patient enough, stop matching each other. I built an entire career on learning to recognize the particular pattern of someone working a long, careful con. I never once imagined I would recognize that exact pattern walking into my own kitchen, holding my son's hand. I came to this work after a decade in general social services, exhausted by my early 30s, by a caseload too broad to ever do any single case real justice, and I remember the exact moment I decided to specialize, sitting across from an 81-year-old man who had signed over power of attorney to a home health aide he'd known for 6 weeks, watching him insist, gently but firmly, that she genuinely loved him and that the rest of us simply didn't understand their relationship. I couldn't help him the way I wanted to that day, the case too far along, the legal protections too thin at the time to reverse what had already happened. I transferred into the Elder Fraud Unit 8 months later, and I've never once regretted the decision, even on the hardest days, because I understood, watching that first case slip away from me, exactly how much difference it makes to catch these patterns early instead of after the damage has already calcified into something the law can no longer fully undo. I've spent 14 years since then trying to make sure fewer people end up exactly where he did, and I've learned, across hundreds of cases, that the people who fall for these schemes aren't foolish or naive in any way that should be mocked or dismissed. They're simply human, reaching for connection the same way anyone does, targeted by people skilled enough to make that reach feel, for a while, like it's finally being met. I want to explain how I got to that kitchen, smiling at a woman I already had an entire case file on, because none of what came after makes sense without understanding the case that came before it. 8 months earlier, I'd been assigned to investigate a complaint filed by Harold Given's daughter, who'd noticed unusual activity in her father's accounts during a routine visit and grown alarmed enough to file a report despite her father's own reluctance to involve anyone. Harold had lost his wife of 41 years to cancer 3 years earlier, and had been, by every account I gathered, a quiet, private man who rarely socialized, spending most of his days tending a small garden and, increasingly, chatting with people online through a hobbyist forum for retired woodworkers. I remember meeting him for the first time in his own kitchen, a house that still had his late wife's reading glasses sitting on the windowsill where she'd apparently always kept them, and understanding immediately, before he'd said a single word about the case, exactly how much loneliness a man that age could be quietly carrying without anyone around him fully noticing. A woman calling herself Melissa Trent had messaged him there nearly a year before the complaint was filed, claiming shared interest in his hobby, and over the following months had built, with what I can only describe as patient, methodical skill, an entire relationship with him almost entirely through text messages and phone calls, never quite able to meet in person due to a string of increasingly elaborate excuses, a sick relative, a work commitment overseas, a car accident that delayed a planned visit indefinitely. Harold showed me screenshots of their conversations during our first interview, hundreds of messages spanning nearly a year, and I remember being struck, even then, by how genuinely skilled she was at the specific craft of it, asking follow-up questions that showed real attentiveness, remembering small details from earlier conversations, building exactly the kind of sustained, patient intimacy that makes a person feel truly known. By the time she asked him for the first loan, framed as a temporary bridge while she waited for an inheritance to clear probate, he had already fallen deeply, genuinely in love with her, the particular vulnerable, hopeful love of a lonely man who had convinced himself, against his own better instincts, that this might actually be real. He wired her $11,000 that first time. Over the following 7 months, the amounts grew, each one accompanied by a new, urgent story, a medical emergency, a legal fee, a business opportunity too good to pass up that would supposedly let her pay him back many times over once it closed. He told me, during one of our interviews, that he'd started keeping a small notebook tracking every promise she'd made about paying him back, dates and amounts, a habit that struck me at the time as almost unbearably poignant, a man still trying to believe in the ledger of a relationship that had never once balanced in his favor. By the time his daughter finally noticed, Harold had wired a total of $183,000 to a woman he had never once met in person, money that represented nearly his entire retirement savings, the pension and careful lifetime of frugal decisions he and his late wife had built together. I spent 4 months on that case, tracing wire transfers through 3 different shell accounts, working with a colleague in cybercrime to trace the IP addresses behind Melissa Trent's messages, building piece by piece, a photograph and a pattern I believed, by the end of it, was strong enough to bring formal charges. I remember the particular satisfaction, professionally, of finally tracing one of those shell accounts back to a payment processor account that had briefly used a legitimate email address before switching to an anonymized one. A small, careless mistake that gave me my first real foothold into who might actually be behind the persona, only for that lead to eventually dead-end at a burner phone purchase with cash and never activated again after the transfer cleared. That was, I think, the moment I first understood how genuinely skilled whoever this was had become at covering her tracks, careful in exactly the places that mattered most, and careless only in the small, forgivable ways that never quite led anywhere useful. And then Harold, exhausted and humiliated by the process of testifying about exactly how thoroughly he'd been deceived, told me quietly in my office that he didn't think he could go through with a trial, that he'd rather absorb the loss privately than have his entire community learn the details of how badly he'd been fooled. I remember sitting across from him that day, watching him twist his wedding ring on his finger the way he did whenever the conversation touched on his late wife, and understanding that pushing him further would cost him something I had no right to ask for. Without a cooperating victim willing to testify, the prosecutor's office declined to pursue charges, and the case, along with the photograph I'd pulled from a video call Harold had saved on his phone, went into a drawer I checked periodically for months afterward, hoping, without much real expectation, that Melissa Trent, or whoever she actually was, would eventually surface again somewhere I could finally close the file properly. She surfaced, 8 months later, in my own kitchen, smiling and shaking my hand, calling herself Chloe Bennett. I've turned that coincidence over more times than I can count since, wondering at the sheer improbability of it. A woman running an elaborate, methodical scheme across 3 states somehow ending up seated at my own dinner table, and I've settled mostly on understanding it not as coincidence in any meaningful sense, but simply as the ordinary math of a small enough world colliding, eventually, with a career spent specifically looking for exactly this kind of person. I didn't say anything that evening. I want to explain why, because I understand it might look, from the outside, like simple shock keeping me quiet. It wasn't only shock. I've spent 14 years learning exactly what happens when a suspect realizes they've been recognized before you have enough evidence gathered to actually stop them, and I understood, watching her laugh easily at something my husband said over dinner, charming and warm in exactly the calculated way I remembered from the video call footage in Harold Given's file, that the single worst thing I could do in that moment was let her see even a flicker of recognition on my face. I got through that dinner somehow, watching my son look at this woman with an expression I recognized instantly, the same hopeful, unguarded love I'd once seen described to me secondhand by a heartbroken 74-year-old widower sitting across from my desk. Ethan is 26, gentle and a little too trusting in exactly the way I'd always privately worried might one day cost him something, and watching him reach for Chloe's hand across our dinner table, laughing at something she said, I felt something far more urgent than professional suspicion settle into my chest. This wasn't a case file anymore. This was my son. I remember excusing myself to the kitchen twice during that dinner under the pretense of checking on dessert, standing at the counter both times with my hands braced against the edge, forcing my breathing back into something steady enough to walk back out and keep performing an ordinary evening. My husband, Paul, noticed nothing unusual, laughing easily with Chloe about a woodworking project he'd been meaning to finish for months, and I remember feeling, watching the two of them, a strange, isolating awareness that I alone in that room understood exactly what kind of danger was sitting at our table, charming and patient, and entirely undetected by anyone but me. I want to be honest about the several hours I spent awake that night, lying beside my husband, running through everything I remembered about the Melissa Trent case, trying to reconcile it against what little I already knew about how serious things had become between Ethan and this woman he'd apparently only been dating for 4 months. He'd mentioned her more and more over recent weeks, casually at first, then with a kind of quiet excitement that told me, even before this dinner, that whatever was developing between them had accelerated faster than his usual pace. I understood, lying there in the dark, that I needed to move carefully and quickly at the same time. A combination I've spent 14 years learning is far harder to manage than either quality on its own. I called my former colleague, a cybercrime detective named Priya Anand, who'd worked the digital tracing on the original case with me, the following morning, before Ethan was even awake in his own apartment across town. I explained everything, careful to keep my voice level even as my hands weren't entirely steady holding the phone, walking her through the dinner, Chloe's face, the specific, unmistakable resemblance to the woman we'd both spent 4 months chasing 8 months earlier without ever getting close enough to actually stop her. Diane, she said, after a long silence on her end of the line, are you completely certain it's the same woman? I don't say that to doubt you. I say it because I need you to be completely certain before either of us moves forward with anything, given who's involved here. I built that file myself, I told her. I watched that video call footage more times than I can count trying to identify her. I don't need a facial recognition match to know what I already know, Priya. But I understand I need one anyway, before I can act on it the way I need to. Send me anything you can pull, she said. A social media photo. Anything public. I'll run it against the still frame from Harold's footage myself, today, before either of us says another word to anyone else about this. She ran the comparison that same afternoon, pulling a still frame from the video call Harold Given had saved against a photo I managed to discreetly pull from Ethan's social media, where Chloe appeared tagged in a handful of recent posts. I remember sitting at my kitchen table waiting for her call back, unable to focus on anything else, running through every possible innocent explanation my mind could construct and finding, each time, that none of them held up against the particular, specific certainty I'd already felt the moment Chloe walked through my door. The match came back at a confidence level high enough that neither of us needed to discuss it further. Melissa Trent and Chloe Bennett were, without meaningful doubt, the same woman. I want to help you build this properly, Priya said. But I need you to understand something first. The same thing I imagine you'd tell any family member sitting across from your own desk in a case like this. Confronting her too early, without a fully documented case, gives her every opportunity to disappear the way she disappeared on Harold Given, except this time she'll be taking whatever she can get from your son with her when she goes. How long? I asked. How long am I supposed to sit across the table from this woman, knowing what I know, watching my son fall further in love with someone I know is going to destroy him? I know it's not fair to ask that of you, she said, her voice softening. But you already know, better than almost anyone I work with, exactly what happens to a case when it moves too fast. I need 2 weeks, Diane. Maybe less if the digital trail comes together quickly.
Can you hold that long?
I told her I could, though I wasn't entirely certain in that moment that it was true. I want to explain something about how these particular scams actually work, because I don't think most people outside my field fully understand the mechanics of it. Women and occasionally men who run long-term romance and affinity fraud schemes rarely operate under a single identity across their entire career. They build a new persona for each target, sometimes several running concurrently, carefully tailored to whatever specific loneliness or vulnerability they've identified in that particular person. The pattern that connects them isn't the name or the story. It's the method, the careful pacing of trust building before the first small request, the escalating urgency of each subsequent ask, the specific kind of warmth that feels, to the person receiving it, indistinguishable from genuine love, precisely because building that convincing warmth is the entire professional skill being deployed. I've come to think of it, over the years, less as lying in the ordinary sense and more as a kind of long-form performance, sustained convincingly enough for long enough that even the performer sometimes seems to lose track of where the character ends and something resembling a real feeling might begin, though I've learned not to extend that theory much sympathy once the financial damage is actually counted. Over the following 2 weeks, Priya and I worked quietly, methodically, the same way I would build any case I intended to hold up under scrutiny. She traced Chloe Bennett's digital footprint back through 3 previous identities across 2 states, each one attached to a different older, financially comfortable victim, patterns of correspondence that matched, almost exactly, the pacing and language documented in Harold Given's case. One of those earlier victims, a widow in her 60s named Constance Reyes, had lost nearly $60,000 2 years earlier to a woman calling herself Ashley Marsh. Before that persona, too, simply vanished once the well had apparently run dry. I didn't confront Ethan directly during those 2 weeks, though I saw him twice, careful, ordinary visits where I watched him with an attentiveness that felt uncomfortably like watching a stranger's case unfold rather than my own son's relationship. He mentioned, during the second visit, that Chloe had been talking about a business opportunity, some kind of early investment round in a friend's startup, and that he was considering putting in a meaningful amount of his savings alongside her own, since she'd apparently already committed a substantial sum herself and was so excited about the potential returns. I felt something cold move through me hearing that, the exact shape of the same escalating ask I'd traced through Harold Given's file 8 months earlier, dressed up this time in language calibrated for a 26-year-old instead of a lonely widower, an investment opportunity instead of a medical emergency, but built from the identical underlying architecture, urgency, exclusivity, the flattering implication that he'd been specially chosen for an opportunity most people never got access to. Don't sign anything yet, I told him, keeping my voice as casual as I could manage. Not till I've had a chance to look at the paperwork properly. You know that's just what I do, sweetheart. I look at things like this for a living. He laughed, easily, the particular fond, slightly exasperated laugh of a grown son used to his mother's professional caution. Mom, it's not one of your elder fraud cases. It's just Chloe. Humor me anyway, I said, and something in my voice must have carried more weight than I intended, because he agreed, a little more seriously than his laugh had suggested, to wait until I'd looked things over before committing any money. I want to be honest about how strange those 2 weeks felt, professionally and personally at once. I had spent 14 years teaching myself to maintain a clear line between the cases I worked and the family I went home to every evening, and suddenly that line had simply dissolved. The same careful methodology I used on strangers' files now applied, with a precision that frightened me a little, to my own son's relationship. I found myself running Priya's updates through the exact same mental checklist I use for every case: what's confirmed, what's still circumstantial, what additional corroboration would strengthen the pattern, and then, in the same breath, feeling the entirely different, unprofessional terror of a mother watching her child walk towards something dangerous in slow motion. I didn't tell Paul everything right away, a decision I've gone back and forth on since, though I understood, at the time, that he tends to react quickly and emotionally to threats against our family, and I needed the 2 weeks to unfold quietly, without anyone's behavior shifting in a way that might alert Chloe before the case was fully built. I finally told him everything 4 days before that second dinner, giving him just enough time to prepare himself for what was coming without giving him so much time that his own anger might spill over into something premature. "You've known for almost 2 weeks, he said, when I finally explained it, his voice carrying a mixture of relief and disbelief. "You've been sitting on this for 2 weeks. "I've been building a case for 2 weeks, I told him. "There's a difference, and it's the same difference that determines whether she disappears with whatever she can still get from Ethan, or whether she finally answers for everything she's already taken from other people too." He was quiet for a long moment, and then he nodded slowly, the particular nod of someone who trusts the person across from them even when the waiting has cost him something. "Okay," he said. "Tell me what you need from me for the dinner." I want to explain that this was, in some ways, the hardest part of the entire case for me professionally, because I understood I was racing against a clock I couldn't fully see. If Chloe sensed any hesitation building in Ethan, any delay in the investment he'd apparently already told her he was excited about, she might accelerate the timeline, or worse, cut her losses on this particular target and disappear the way she'd disappeared on every previous one, taking whatever partial funds she'd already extracted and leaving my son not only financially damaged but heartbroken in a way I understood, from 14 years of sitting across from her previous victims, could take years to fully recover from. I remember driving home from that visit gripping the steering wheel tightly enough that my knuckles ached, running through every possible way the timeline could break in either direction, and understanding that whatever I decided over the following days needed to be exactly right, because I wasn't going to get a second chance to protect him if I moved too slowly. Priya and I finished building the formal case file 12 days after that dinner. Photographs, matched digital footprints, financial records from 2 previous victims willing, this time, to go on record given the strength of the evidence we could show them, and a clear, documented pattern spanning at least 3 states and 4 separate identities. I called Constance Reyes myself, the widow who'd lost $60,000 2 years earlier, and something in the careful, respectful way I approached her, understanding exactly the kind of shame she'd been carrying privately for 2 years, seemed to matter enormously in her decision to finally cooperate formally. I remember sitting with her on the phone for nearly an hour that first call, letting her tell the whole story at her own pace, understanding that rushing her toward the practical question of testimony before she'd had room to simply be heard would have cost us the cooperation we needed far more than the extra time cost either of us. "I've wanted someone to actually catch her for 2 years, she told me, her voice steady despite everything. "I just didn't think anyone ever would. Whatever you need from me, I'll give it if it means she doesn't do this to anyone else." I invited Ethan and Chloe to dinner at our house the following weekend, the same dinner where I'd first met her, the framing carefully chosen, a casual family gathering, nothing that would signal to her that anything had shifted since our first meeting. I want to explain that I spent a long time deciding exactly how to handle that evening, weighing Priya's advice about formal channels, the possibility of simply handing everything to the district attorney's office and letting the legal process unfold on its own timeline, against my own understanding, as both an investigator and a mother, that Ethan needed to see the evidence directly, clearly, in a way that would leave no room for the particular denial I'd watched grip Harold, given even after everything had come apart. I remember sitting with Priya in her office 2 days before that dinner, walking through exactly how I intended to present it, and her cautioning me, gently, that emotion in that room was inevitable and probably necessary, but that the evidence itself needed to carry the weight, laid out plainly, without embellishment, the same way I'd present it to any prosecutor deciding whether a case was strong enough to move forward. "You're going to want to soften it because it's your son," she told me. "Don't. He needs the same clarity you'd give anyone else in that chair, maybe more, because the alternative is him spending months in the kind of doubt Harold Given lived in before he finally accepted what actually happened to him." I took that advice seriously, and I think, looking back, it was the right one, because the version of that evening where I'd tried to cushion the truth for Ethan's sake would likely have given Chloe exactly the opening she needed to talk her way back into his trust before the evidence had a chance to fully land. Dinner unfolded ordinarily at first, Chloe warm and engaging exactly the way I remembered from our first meeting, asking my husband thoughtful questions about his retirement woodworking projects, complimenting the meal, reaching for Ethan's hand across the table in small, easy gestures that looked, to anyone without the file I was carrying, like nothing more than ordinary affection. I watched her work the room the way I'd once watched the video footage of her working Harold Given, the same practiced attentiveness, the same warm, patient listening that made whoever she was speaking to feel like the only person in the room. Paul mentioned at one point how glad he was that Ethan had found someone who seemed to genuinely care about getting to know the whole family, and I remember having to look down at my plate for a moment, unable to let my face show what that particular comment cost me to hear. I waited until the plates were cleared, until my husband had poured coffee, and then I set a folder down on the table between us, the same careful, deliberate motion I use in my own office when a case has finally reached the point where the evidence needs to speak for itself. Before we finished the evening, I said, "I think there's something everyone at this table needs to see." Chloe's smile faltered slightly, a flicker so brief I might have missed it if I hadn't spent 14 years trained to notice exactly that kind of flicker. "What's this about, Diane?" she asked, her voice still light, though something underneath it had gone carefully alert. I opened the folder and set the first photograph on the table, a still frame pulled from Harold Given's saved video call, a woman calling herself Melissa Trent, unmistakably, undeniably, the same woman sitting across from my son at that very table. "This is a photograph from a case I investigated 8 months ago," I said. "A 74-year-old widower named Harold Given lost $183,000 to a woman using this identity. The facial recognition match to you is well above the threshold my department considers conclusive." The table had gone completely silent, Ethan's face shifting from confusion to something far more devastated as he looked between the photograph and the woman beside him. "Mom, what are you talking about?" he said, though I could hear, underneath the question, that some part of him had already started understanding exactly what I was talking about. "I have a second case," I continued, laying out another photograph, involving a woman named Ashley Marsh, who took $60,000 from a widow named Constance Reyes 2 years ago, using an identical pattern, right down to the specific language used to request the first loan. Both women are the same person sitting at this table tonight. Chloe stood up abruptly, her chair scraping hard against the floor. "This is insane," she said, her voice sharper now, the warmth gone entirely from it in a way that told me, more than any photograph could have, exactly who I was actually looking at. "I don't know what you think you've found, but you're clearly confusing me with someone else." "I don't think I am," I said, keeping my own voice level, the same steady, unhurried tone I use with every suspect I've ever sat across from professionally. "I have digital forensics tracing your accounts back through at least 4 separate identities. I have a cooperating witness in Constance Reyes, willing to testify. And I have a case that was previously closed only because the original victim was too ashamed to continue, a gap I don't intend to leave open for you to walk through again." Paul, sitting frozen beside me through all of this, finally found his voice. "Diane, are you certain?" he asked, and I understood, hearing the question, that he needed to hear it from me directly, plainly, before he could fully accept what was unfolding at his own dinner table. "I built the original case file myself," I told him. "I've spent 2 weeks confirming it beyond any reasonable doubt before saying a single word to either of you. I wouldn't have brought this to this table otherwise." Ethan sat frozen at the table, staring at the woman he'd brought home to meet his family 2 weeks earlier, and I watched something in his face collapse in the particular way I'd seen collapse on Harold Given's face months earlier, the slow, devastating understanding of realizing the person you'd let yourself love completely had been building something calculated the entire time. "Ethan," Chloe said, her voice softening again, reaching for something in her purse. "I can explain this. It's not what it looks like." "Don't," I said, standing between them without quite meaning to, the same protective instinct that had first driven me into this line of work 14 years earlier now aimed directly at my own family's dining room. "Whatever you're about to say, I'd think very carefully before you say it in front of a state investigator with an open case file." She looked at me for a long moment, something calculating and cold moving behind her eyes, entirely unlike the warmth she'd performed so convincingly 20 minutes earlier, and then, without another word, she grabbed her coat and walked out of our house, the door closing behind her with a sound that felt, in that suddenly silent dining room, far louder than it should have. Ethan didn't move for a long time after she left. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. "How long have you known?" he asked. "Since the moment she walked into this kitchen 2 weeks ago," I told him. "I needed to be certain before I said anything, Ethan. I needed evidence strong enough that you wouldn't spend the next several months in denial the way Harold Given did, wondering if I'd simply been wrong." He put his head in his hands, and I sat down beside him, and for a long time neither of us said anything at all, the particular heavy silence that comes right after someone finally understands they've been deceived by someone they trusted completely. The following weeks moved the way these things tend to once the truth is finally documented and formal. Priya's team, working alongside the original prosecutor's office, reopened the case with Constance Reyes's cooperation and the new, undeniable evidence connecting Chloe Bennett's identity to at least 3 previous aliases. 2 more victims came forward within a month of the arrest, women and men in their 60s and 70s who had each, independently, believed themselves the only one who'd ever fallen for her particular blend of patient, calculated warmth. The total amount she'd extracted across 4 identities and 3 states, once investigators finished tracing everything, exceeded $400,000. I sat in on several of the follow-up interviews myself, watching each new victim describe a version of the same careful, patient courtship, the same escalating requests dressed in a different urgent story each time, and I understood, more clearly with each interview, exactly how systematically she had refined the same underlying method across every target. Ethan testified as a witness to the pattern of manipulation he'd personally experienced, careful testimony about the specific investment ask she'd been building toward with him, evidence that, combined with the older cases, helped establish the consistency of her methods across every victim she'd targeted. I sat in the courtroom during his testimony, watching my son describe, with a steadiness that made me quietly proud even in the middle of everything, exactly how convincing her performance of love had been, useful information for the prosecution, and, I think, a necessary piece of his own healing, saying the whole shape of it out loud in a room where everyone believed him completely. I remember watching the jury's faces during his testimony, the particular attentive stillness of people finally understanding how sophisticated this kind of manipulation actually is, not the crude, obvious con some of them had probably imagined walking in, but something patient and genuinely skilled enough to fool a room full of people who loved the victim and were watching closely for warning signs. The defense attorney tried, during cross-examination, to suggest that Ethan's account was colored by his mother's profession, that he'd simply absorbed my suspicion rather than experiencing genuine manipulation himself. I watched him answer that question directly, without hesitation, describing the specific moment Chloe had first mentioned the investment opportunity, the exact phrasing she'd used, the particular urgency in her voice when she'd suggested he might miss the window if he waited too long to decide. It wasn't my suspicion he was describing. It was his own memory, clear and specific enough that I understood, watching him, he'd already done the difficult work of separating what had actually happened to him from what I'd since taught him to recognize it as. He struggled for a long while afterward, the particular grief of having genuinely loved someone who had never once been real in the way he understood her to be, a grief I recognized, uncomfortably, from every previous victim I'd ever sat across from professionally, except this time I was watching it unfold in my own son instead of a stranger's file. I made sure, deliberately, not to let my professional distance creep into how I supported him through it, resisting the urge to treat his heartbreak as simply another case reaching its resolution, understanding that whatever closure the legal process eventually provided, the personal repair was going to take considerably longer. He moved back home for 2 months that summer, something I don't think either of us expected at 26, and we spent a lot of quiet evenings on the back porch not talking about any of it directly, simply sitting together in a way that felt, slowly, like it was doing more good than any direct conversation could have managed. Chloe Bennett, whose actual legal name turned out to be neither Chloe nor Melissa nor Ashley but a fourth identity entirely, Dana Whitlock, pleaded guilty eventually to multiple counts of fraud rather than risk the combined weight of testimony from 5 separate victims at trial. She received a sentence that felt, to me, both entirely appropriate and somehow insufficient given the scope of what she'd taken, not just money, but years of trust from people who had, in every case, simply wanted to believe someone finally, genuinely loved them. Harold Given called me the week the plea was finalized, his voice steadier than I remembered from our last conversation 8 months earlier. I heard it finally came together, he said. I wanted to thank you for not giving up on it, even after I couldn't go through with everything back then. You don't owe me any thanks, I told him. You're the reason we had a starting point at all. I'm just glad it finally reached somewhere worth reaching. I think about that dinner often now, the particular cold shock of watching my own son walk into my kitchen holding the hand of a woman I already had a case file on, and I understand, more clearly than I did before it happened, exactly why the victims I've spent 14 years working with take so long to fully see what's actually in front of them. Love, real or performed with enough skill to be indistinguishable from real, has a way of making even a trained eye hesitate, if only for a moment, before it lets itself see clearly. I don't think that hesitation is a weakness. I think it's simply what makes a person capable of trusting anyone at all, the same vulnerability that makes genuine connection possible in the first place, and the exact quality someone like Dana Whitlock spent her entire career learning how to exploit. Ethan is doing better now, slowly, the way I imagine most people eventually do after something like this. He asks me, sometimes, about my cases in a way he never used to before, curious now in a manner that feels less like idle interest and more like someone who finally understands, personally, exactly why the work matters. He mentioned, a few months ago, that he'd started volunteering 1 evening a week at a senior center near his apartment, something he'd never once shown interest in before any of this happened, and when I asked him about it, he told me quietly that he wanted to understand better what loneliness like Harold Given's actually looked like up close, so he'd know how to recognize it in someone else someday before it became something a stranger could exploit. I don't know that I'll ever fully shake the particular caution this experience has left him with, the same careful watchfulness I've carried through 14 years of this job, but I've come to think that caution, hard won as it was, might end up serving him better than the easier trust he carried before any of this happened. Harold called again a few weeks after that first call, mentioning, almost in passing, that he'd told Ethan's story to another man at his woodworking forum who'd confided in him about a woman he'd recently started talking to online, and that Harold had gently encouraged him to be careful, to talk to family before sending anyone money, a small, quiet act of protection passed along from one victim to a stranger who might otherwise have walked the same path. I hope your son knows it's not his fault either, Harold told me during that second call. I spent a long time thinking it made me foolish, what happened to me. It took a while to understand it just made me someone who is still capable of hoping for something good. I don't regret that part, even now. I told Ethan what Harold had said a few days later, sitting together on the back porch, and I watched something in his face ease slightly, the particular relief of hearing, from someone who had genuinely understood exactly the same betrayal from the inside, that hope itself had never been the mistake. So if you've been sitting at my table when that folder came out, watching your own son's face change as the woman he loved turned out to be someone else entirely, I wonder how you'd have found the steadiness to get through the rest of that evening. I still ask myself, sometimes, whether I handled the timing of it exactly right, Whether I should have said something the very night I first recognized her instead of waiting those careful 2 weeks. There's a version of that choice I still turn over some nights, wondering whether 2 weeks of silence cost Ethan something I never fully accounted for, even though I know, professionally, that the case would never have held together without that patience. I've made a kind of peace with the choice I made, though I don't know that the question ever fully stopped circling back. Drop a note down below letting me know whereabouts you're watching from tonight. I always make a point of reading through them. There's more of these stories headed your way soon, so go ahead and subscribe if you want them landing in your feed automatically. Thank you for spending this time with me.